There was a window in the 60s, 70s, and 80s where science fiction and fantasy were not prestige, they were cheap, desperate, and occasionally brilliant in ways nobody planned for. The films that came out of that window were made by people who had nothing to lose, which turns out to be exactly the condition that produces something genuinely new. 1,000,000 Years B.C. became the film that made Raquel Welch one of the most recognizable women on the planet, and then spent the next decade punishing her for it. She plays Loana, a cave woman from the gentler Shell tribe, who rescues a brutish outcast named Tumak and teaches him something resembling compassion, all while a world actively trying to kill them both pays their feelings no attention whatsoever. Harryhausen shoots his creatures with the same indifferent camera he gives the landscape, treating humans and dinosaurs as equally temporary, and that refusal to let the humans be the point is what makes the film feel genuinely prehistoric in a way no amount of dialogue could achieve. Welch arrived in the Canary Islands in the middle of winter wearing almost nothing while the crew wore parkas, told when she asked for a coat that cave girls don't have parkas, and by the end of production had nearly died from an allergic reaction mid-shoot. A unit photographer caught her on a hillside in a pose she later described as her mama bear look, and Hammer sent 10,000 copies to theater owners as Christmas cards. The image killed the blonde bombshell archetype that had defined Hollywood beauty since Marilyn Monroe, changing the visual language of fantasy cinema so completely, you can draw a direct line from that doe-skin bikini to Princess Leia's gold one. The film made over $9 million, and Welch called the image a convict's uniform, eventually winning a Golden Globe for The Three Musketeers in 1974 to prove she was more than the photograph. The industry's response was to keep booking her in costume pictures. The Lost Empire is the film its director spent 20 years trying to find after the theater chain that financed it changed ownership, and the rights vanished into legal limbo. Angel is a police officer whose brother is murdered by an immortal wizard's cult, and she recruits Witstar, a Native American mystic, and Heather, a convict with superhuman strength who wants out of prison more than she wants anything else. Together they infiltrate the Wizard's Island fortress, and what makes the film more interesting than its reputation suggests is that these three women have completely different reasons for being there and never pretend otherwise. Director Jim Wynorski had been running Roger Corman's marketing department, had never directed a feature, and shot the whole thing on Corman's sound stages, later saying it felt like a tax loss from the moment he read the script. He poured everything he had into it anyway, on the assumption this might be his only chance. Raven de la Croix came to the set having already starred in Russ Meyer's Up, and secured credits as associate producer, costume designer, and on-set animal handler before a single frame was shot. She was the Woman Entertainment Weekly's critic called possibly Meyer's most spectacular siren, and she brought that same complete physical commitment to a 16-day tax loss picture, designing her own fringe buckskin costume to allow full martial arts movement, and then fighting through the climactic arena sequence while it repeatedly tore open mid-take. That is either the most committed performance in the film, or proof that some people bring the same thing to every room they walk into, regardless of the budget. The director spent decades tracking down the rights before securing a DVD release in 2014, 30 years after it was made. He described the whole experience as a deep personal regret for a film that was never supposed to matter to anyone, least of all him. She is a warrior queen ruling a tribe of women in a post-apocalyptic wasteland so thoroughly stripped of context that it has no memory of what civilization was. Bergman plays her as someone who has never needed to justify her power to anyone, carrying that absolute self-possession through confrontations with a robot Frankenstein, mummies with chainsaws, and an army wearing Nazi helmets and pink tutus. The tutus were reportedly the only costumes left in the warehouse when the production ran out of money, forcing the director to convince humiliated extras it was high art. The script had almost nothing to do with the H. Rider Haggard novel it claimed to be based on, and featured three protagonists named Tom, Dick, and Harry. Bergman had just won a Golden Globe for Conan the Barbarian, and performed all her own stunts because no stunt women could be found to match her size. She brought a physical commitment to every sequence that refused to acknowledge how genuinely insane the situation around her was. What makes that commitment interesting is that it accidentally created something the script never intended, a world so stripped of its own history that fragments of collapsed civilizations are wearing whatever they could find. The film spent 2 years unable to find distribution, and surfaced in most territories in 1984 and 85. Bergman never led another studio film after it, spending the rest of her career in supporting roles in productions less interesting than the one she carried entirely on her own back. Battle Beyond the Stars launched James Cameron's career, and Roger Corman paid him $1,200 for it. Shad is a naive young farmer from a peaceful planet threatened by a warlord who converts entire worlds into energy, and he assembles a crew of mercenaries who are interesting precisely because each one is broken in a specific way. The assassin is so wealthy and hunted he has nowhere safe to live. The warrior woman so devoted to a glorious death she is the most dangerous person in any room. The collective alien consciousness quietly loses members and chooses to stay anyway. Corman gave them enough screen time to become actual people before killing them, which is more than most studio science fiction has bothered to do with 10 times the budget. Cameron slept under the model tables to finish the effects work, building spacecraft interiors out of pizza boxes and McDonald's containers because there was nothing else available. The ships feel more genuinely lived in than most bigger productions, because he was forced to make the garbage feel real rather than choosing to. James Horner composed the score for only his third film credit and spent the next decade accused of borrowing from himself on Star Trek II, Aliens, and eventually Titanic. Corman eventually sent Galen Hurd to check on Cameron during post-production. She found him in the effects department, and they married in 1985. Together they made the Terminator and Aliens, meaning the chain of events that reshaped science fiction cinema started because a production designer quit a $2 million knockoff, and Corman needed someone to sweep up. Heavy Metal is the film an entire generation grew up hearing about without being able to legally own, because the producers forgot to secure the soundtrack rights for anything beyond theatrical release. That kept it off home video for 15 years, turning legal incompetence into the most powerful marketing campaign in the Columbia Pictures library. The film is an animated anthology tied together by a glowing green orb of pure evil called the Loch-Nar that moves through time, corrupting everything it touches. It covers a cynical New York cab driver who stumbles into something bigger than his shift, a nerdy teenager transported to a barbarian world and given a body that finally matches his fantasies, and a silent warrior named Tarna who sacrifices herself to destroy it when no one else can. The tone shifts are radical because the Loch-Nar corrupts differently in every era, and what the anthology format captures is the sheer variety of ways power degrades whoever touches it. For nearly 15 years, the only way to see it was through bootleg tapes or midnight screenings, and every person who found it felt like they had discovered something the system was actively hiding from them. That turned out to be exactly the kind of reputation a film about a corrupting object of pure evil deserves to have. Heavy Metal played midnight shows across the country for a decade while the studio that made it couldn't legally sell it to anyone. When the rights finally resolved in 1997, it sold over 1 million copies in its first month. Galaxina put Dorothy Stratton's estranged husband on set for nearly the entire production, his near-constant presence causing daily arguments and visible tension that cast and crew noticed and nobody could stop. She was Playboy's Playmate of the Year and was in the process of leaving a man who viewed her, according to people close to both of them, not as a wife but as a possession attempting to escape. The film follows the crew of an intergalactic police cruiser sent to retrieve a mystical crystal from a planet run by a cult that worships Harley-Davidson motorcycles. The standout is Galaxina herself, the ship's android pilot, who spends the first half silent and untouchable before quietly reprogramming herself to feel something for the crewmen who treated her like a person rather than equipment. Stratton played that transformation with a physical stillness that worked precisely because the character was discovering emotions one at a time, finding them the way someone finds objects in an unfamiliar room. The performance was more controlled and more specific than anyone gave her credit for at the time. The film was released on June 6, 1980, and had already been in theaters for 2 months when Stratton was killed at age 20 on August 14th, her estranged husband turning the gun on himself immediately after. Bob Fosse directed a film about her life in 1983, and a television movie came the same year, both trying to make sense of what happened. Neither was as quietly devastating as watching the one she actually made. Galaxy of Terror proved James Cameron could solve any problem on any budget, including the problem of maggots that refused to perform. The film follows a rescue crew sent to a desolate planet where an ancient pyramid kills each of them by manifesting their deepest fear as a physical force. Every death is personal and specific rather than random, and that specificity is what separates it from the dozens of alien imitations flooding the market in 1981. Cameron was the production designer at roughly $1,200 flat. And when the maggots in one pivotal scene refused to move under studio lights, he wired the surface to a power strip and sent electrical jolts through it. 2 producers watching from the sidelines had no idea about the hidden switch, and when Cameron called cut and the worms stopped on cue, they were so impressed by his apparent control over primitive larvae that they hired him on the spot to direct his first feature film. That film was eventually Piranha 2. Roger Corman stepped in to direct the film's most notorious scene himself after both the director and the actress flat out refused, with the 1-ton prop nearly crushing her in the process. The finished cut received an X rating before small edits brought it to an R. Cameron later directed Aliens, and the optical effects supervisor on that film noted in a commentary that it looks a great deal like Galaxy of Terror. The set dresser who carried furniture on this production was a young Bill Paxton, not yet an actor. He appeared in Aliens as a named character with actual dialogue, which is the distance between what Cameron could offer in 1981 and what he could deliver 4 years later. Spacehunter fired its original director after 2 weeks, scrapped all his footage, and discovered 2 future stars in the wreckage. Wolf is a broke salvage pilot who takes a rescue job on a plague-ravaged planet purely for the bounty money. And Nikki is a feral orphan who grew up in the wasteland with no patience for his mercenary logic. The film is at its best in the friction between a man who stopped caring and a girl who never had the luxury of that option. The junkyard texture of their world feels genuinely inhabited because nobody had time to make anything look deliberate. That accidental authenticity gives the film a physical grit that more expensive productions spend fortunes trying to manufacture. An early makeup concept for Molly Ringwald's character was described by the department as resembling a mandrill, which is the kind of note that explains why the director who approved it was gone by week 3. Ringwald was 15 years old in only her second film role, and she later said she figured she could fix the dialogue when she got there, relieved when the replacement director arrived and said exactly the same thing. Ernie Hudson played a rival bounty hunter for roughly 30 minutes and gave a performance so effortlessly charismatic that it caught Ivan Reitman's eye, leading directly to Ghostbusters the following year. Ringwald went on to 16 Candles and became the defining face of the American teenager. The film that first noticed both of them sits in a junkyard on a plague planet, still waiting for someone to return the favor. Logans Run predicted surveillance states, mandatory euthanasia, and the compulsive worship of youth with enough accuracy that it plays less like science fiction now, and more like a period piece, set approximately 15 minutes from the present. Logan 5 is a Sandman, a government enforcer whose job is hunting down people who flee the mandatory death ceremony on their 30th birthday. The film's genius is that he believes in what he does right up until his own clock starts counting down, turning him from predator to prey without changing anything about who he is. Director Michael Anderson shoots Carousel with the swooping grandeur of a religious ceremony, the crowd cheering, the lights beautiful, the people vaporizing still smiling on the way up. That image of institutional murder dressed as liberation is the most quietly devastating thing the film does, and the studio that mandated 15 minutes of cuts apparently never noticed it was in there. MGM tripled the budget to $9 million, and then softened the world they had paid to build. Richard Jordan stepped in as a last-minute replacement after William Devane left for a Hitchcock film and delivered the film's most frightening performance as the hunter Francis who never stops and never questions. He died of a brain tumor in 1993, largely forgotten by an industry he had served for 30 years. CBS subsequently paid the novel's author $9 million for a television adaptation that ran 14 episodes before cancellation.